Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about our friend, the Sega Saturn. And specifically the fact that it is 30 years old today, if you're watching this the day it came out. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, my travel channel. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you very much. Let's get into it. So, you might have noticed if you're a fan of this channel, or if you've been watching me for the last, few days, it's been kind of a strange week. So November 21st, November 21st, 2004 was the 20th anniversary of the Nintendo DS, and to that end, I released a day before that on November 20th, the 20th anniversary video, where we go back, we just talk about it, go down memory lane, that type of thing. Also, as it happens, November 21st, 1994 was the 30th anniversary of the Sega 32X, which I did a video on as well. But November 22nd, 1994 is the launch of the Sega Saturn in Japan. And I said this in the 32X video. Because of time zones, and the fact that Japan is a day ahead of the US, November 22nd, 1994 in Japan is November 21st, 1994 in the US. In essence, the Sega 32X and the Sega Saturn launched on the same day. And so we're going to talk about that. So it's 30 years of Sega Saturn. Now, the point of this video is not so much a comprehensive history of the system or a look at every single variant or anything like that, not going over every single game. I've already done like a history video on the Sega Saturn. That's part of my recap series. This is not that. This is us just kind of waxing nostalgic. Let's just talk a little bit about it. So yes, we'll talk some history. Yes, we'll talk some personal experience. And yes, we'll talk some games and so on and so forth. But yeah, this is just going to be kind of a fun chit chat. Let's all talk. So here's what you need to know. As I mentioned, we talked about the launch date, and again, if you're watching this today, it came out 30 years today. So go play your Sega Saturn, and hopefully you played some 32X if you have one, and DS as well. But yeah, in Japan, we need to go over the little bit of the history there. So while we tend to think of the Sega Genesis in the United States in particular as this big hit, it was in the US and Canada. As the Mega Drive, it was pretty successful in Europe. It actually did very poorly in Japan as the Mega Drive. And Japan being a very prideful country, and of course Sega being a Japanese company in of itself, was kind of miffed about the fact that the Mega Drive wasn't doing well for them. So they constantly tried to find different ways to make it work over there. That's actually why the Sega CD was born, because they thought, well, karaoke is popular, this new music technology is popular. If we build our own like music CD karaoke device and we say, hey, all you got to do to use it is connect a Mega Drive, people might buy the Mega Drive. Like, they were constantly trying to find little ways in and out of that. They never got it to work. So eventually they decided, okay, we're going to make a system specifically built for the Japanese home market with Japanese interests. That was the Sega Saturn. That was obviously caused some issues because they didn't really intend it to function that well outside of their own market, which is where the 32X comes in, but we already talked about that. Point is, Sega just did not have a clear vision of what to do globally, and that resulted in way too much hardware, etc. But out of that, we did get the Sega Saturn. This is the initial version that we got, the gray version. Now, granted, this came out in Japan. Our version, which would come out in the United States in June of '95, if I recall correctly, was all black and was the same basic shape. This is often referred to as the oval button model. You ask me, I like this gray, blue decal, if you will, that the Japanese did more, it's better. Later, they would revise it and do this white version that we know as the round button edition. We would also get this, but again, all black. I like this too. This is kind of inspires the color of the Dreamcast. Eventually would be white, and then instead of having this like pink, eject button, you would get the Dreamcast like triangle LED there and everything. And yes, what we have in front of us is of course the unreleased Sega Pluto prototype, and the only reason this is here is because we actually have this one of two prototype in the world, and I thought let's just include it as a bonus. The Sega Pluto, which is not super relevant to this video to be totally honest, was an upgraded version of the Sega Saturn designed by Sega of America with internet capabilities, specifically a built-in modem, built-in hard drive. Think Xbox Game Pass, but for the Sega Saturn. It was going to use Sega Channel. We know now that it would have retailed for $550 in 1997, and we know that Sega of America loved the idea But Sega of Japan hated it and said we didn't want to make an Americanized version of the Saturn, so they more or less killed it. That, and financially speaking, it would never have worked. I mean, in '97, $550, that'd be like releasing a system today for like $1,500. You think people were mad about the PS5 Pro? They ain't got nothing on that. But anyway, since we actually have it, I thought I would just pop it into the video. There's way too many Sega Saturn variants. I can't possibly include them all. I certainly don't have them all. But yeah, point is, the system launches 30 years ago today. And here's the funny thing. We often, in the United States in particular, tend to think of the Sega Saturn as this like ridiculous flop. Oh, it killed Sega and they barely got the Dreamcast out. Not true. The system was actually a pretty big hit in Japan. In fact, it only lost to the PS1. This system defeated the N64. And I find that funny too, because we often think of the N64 as this like big hit. The N64 did not have stellar sales. In fact, it also had a very low game library, something like 300 titles, but we still see it as a huge success because like 10 of those games are iconic. Super Mario 64, Star Fox 64, whatever. Those type of games were big hits. The Sega Saturn, globally, most of which came out of Japan, admittedly, had like 1,500 games released for it, and we often think of it as this disaster. That is an example of when you exist in one culture, how you should try to study others to see other perspectives, because you can learn a lot. And in this case, Japan really changes the narrative on the history of the Sega Saturn into being one of positivity. Now, you can go into the development of the system and everything and like what they were thinking, but we've kind of told that story in like my, Sega Saturn recap video, so I don't really want to go through that again. But what I do want to say is that yes, the North American launch was famously botched. They did a surprise launch in the summer of '95. They released largely broken iterations of some of the games that were in development. They wanted to get ahead on Sony and their PlayStation, and it just really didn't work. The system was also $100 more and was just kind of built for a different mentality. That's all that you really need to know about that. The system, though, it survives a lot longer. I think its final release was in 2003 in Japan, whereas North America, it was effectively dead by 1997, which would have been the same year the Pluto would have launched, incidentally. But that said, it still had a lot of really cool experiences on it, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about some of them. But as I have said in the past, my own personal experience with the Saturn is kind of embarrassing. I had never heard of it, ever, in the 90s. I did not have a friend who had one. I didn't have a cousin who had one. I didn't know anyone at school who had one. If you saw the last two videos in this, you will know that like I actually had a friend who had the 32X. And we were all talking video games all the time. So you had like, oh, my buddy over there has like this thing. I had heard of the TurboGrafx 16, but I had never heard of the Saturn. If you watch my DS video, you'll know that that was an era when I was talking about Super Mario 64 DS, that I grew up in the 90s on the N64 version, and back then there were all sorts of rumors about, oh, Luigi's a hidden character. Like kids, we talked about video games. And even in that environment, I never heard of the Sega Saturn. I heard of the Virtual Boy, but I had never heard of the Sega Saturn, which really says something about how bad Sega of America's marketing was around this system. It's very, very sad. So I think the first time I was ever really aware of the Saturn was after the Dreamcast, as insane as that is. Because the Dreamcast, as much as I love it, favorite video game system of all time, was very short-lived, relatively speaking. And so once it ended, I started to get nostalgic about like Sega's history and what I had missed, to the point where I actually believed that after the Genesis, with the exception of the 32X, that Sega just went away and never made consoles again until they suddenly reemerged with the Dreamcast. I had no idea there was like another system in there. So once I learned that, I kind of got curious about it, and I started going back and picking up a lot of Sega consoles I had missed. Like, I had no idea there was a Master System. That was over before I was even really cognizant of my own existence. Well, except for Brazil, where it's still active to this day. But I decided, you know what, I kind of want to learn more about this system. So I ended up finding one, picking one up off of eBay back when they were dirt cheap back then. You could get the system, a bunch of games, and then I learned like what the game library even was, and I started trying to pick out some of my favorites. And that actually, I think, is a good segue into our first game that we're going to talk about. It's worth noting there is This is not even close to all the Sega Saturn games that I have, but I have to just pick a couple of highlights that I have some story about for one reason or another. Otherwise, we would be here for a month. And, you know, we don't want to do that. I want you to enjoy the video and then go play your Sega Saturn. So let's talk about the game I was the most interested in once I was aware of the existence of the system. Sonic Jam. Now, the reason I wanted Sonic Jam is, of course, I grew up on the Genesis era. Of course, I loved the Sonic games from that era. And I just thought, wouldn't it be cool to like have whatever the Sonic game was for the Saturn? Because in my naive little brain at the time, I assumed, like I think most people would have, that Sega's like mainstream console effort would have had some sort of definitive edition Sonic game. Well, it had 3 Sonic games, but none of them really, you know, meet that criteria. Sonic Jam is a collection of the Sega Genesis games, specifically Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles. And hilariously, if you watched my DS video, you'll know that the same collection actually existed for that. The only thing that made this one kind of special, there was 2 things. One, they had like a 3D world you could walk around as Sonic in to kind of interact and get to the games and get to some bonus features and things like that. That was neat. And the rebuild of Sonic 1 actually included spin dash support, which is actually very uncommon. I think the GBA version of the game does that too, and that's like it. Like the Genesis one never did that. So it was basically a nice new way to play that game. And this was like probably the best Sonic game on the system, and it was really just games from a different system. The other 2 that it had was Sonic 3D Blast, which was just like an upgraded, if you will, version from the Genesis game. And then the only thing that was kind of exclusive to it and actually built for it was a game called Sonic R, which was a racing game, which is not a very good game. It has a cool score. You're either totally on board with it or you just hate it. I like it. Can You Feel the Sunshine? I love that song. I don't even care. I love that song. I want that on vinyl. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a good... That song slaps. But again, I have no musical taste whatsoever. So take my opinion with a grain of salt. But, yeah, that game... By the way, if you ever do play Sonic R, recommendation. Pick Knuckles, don't pick Sonic. Get through the first level, even though it's a slog. Then the game gets better. The problem with that game is the first level kind of sucks, and everybody picks Sonic, who handles the worst. So naturally, your first impression is this game is bad. It doesn't get better under certain conditions. But anyway, yeah, that's all the Sonic content, oddly enough, they produced for this thing, which is insane. So I was like, all right, well, what was Sonic Team doing? Well, they did make what is the most iconic game for the system, Nights into Dreams. So I remember when I first finally sat down and played this. It must have been 2003. A friend of mine at the time in high school, he knew what the Saturn was. Like, I didn't grow up around him. Like, you know, I met him in high school, like, after the Dreamcast was over and everything, and I was aware of what the Saturn was. But we got the Saturn, and he had actually, you know, had never known anybody to own a Saturn before, and he had always wanted to play this game. I actually had no interest in it, but he knew that this game was like the one that if you were the random Saturn kid out there, this was probably the game you were celebrating. And so once I got the Saturn, he's like, can I play Knights? I was like, I don't have that. He goes out and buys the game just so he can bring it to my place and play it. So we played Nights into Dreams. I ended up liking it enough that I went out and bought it myself. There's multiple variants of this. This is the kind of uncommon long box version that matches with the set. There was also this bigger like cardboard box that came with the 3D controller and like a standard jewel case edition. That's what we had. But anyway, so he goes out and he picks that up. We kind of fell in love with this game. We just thought, wow, this is a lot of fun, you know? It didn't age that well, though. I remember playing this again like maybe a few years ago and being like, Now, to be fair, I played the Xbox 360 like reissue. I want to like this game more now than I do. I don't know. I know that's going to break the hearts of some Saturn fans. I love it on the Saturn, and I have nice memories of it there. And I'm going to keep them there because I don't personally get too into it. There is a Christmas edition of this game, by the way, which is cool. But yeah, Nights into Dreams. Another one that Sonic Team did, and one of the better games, actually, shout out to my buddy Atlanta Dave, Burning Rangers. Burning Rangers was a cool, like, futuristic fire department game where you, like, run around and put out fires and stuff. It's really, really cool. Made by the team that made Knights, as well as, obviously, most of those Sonic games. And the music in this game absolutely slaps. The Japanese version of this, the Saturn release, comes with a little bonus mini disc that has some of those songs. I was hanging out in Atlanta with my buddy Atlanta Dave, and he was playing this game for like the first time, and he was just getting all into it just because of the music. And then he actually enjoyed the game. So this is definitely one of the few Saturn games where you can throw this in front of a casual and say, try this out, see what you think. It looks crude, it looks rudimentary, sure, but you can get into it. It's a nice kind of weird. It's fun. One other thing to point out is, so I did mention that when the Saturn came out, they kind of had some botched early builds of games. One of them was Virtua Fighter. So because that was such a big franchise for Sega and they wanted it to do well, they would eventually upgrade and reissue the game as Virtua Fighter Remix. Now, this version in particular, so this game was reissued to people who bought Virtua Fighter. I believe you were just mailed out a replacement disc called Virtua Fighter Remix. There was a couple of jewel case versions, a cardboard sleeve version, and then there was this long box version. This long box version of the game, which is, the game itself is much better than the original. But this long box version is by far the rarest one because this was only released in Canada. We never got the long box version in the US just because our distribution system for the game was kind of a giveaway thing. But in Canada, I guess they didn't have that problem, so they were able to sell it retail. So if you ever want the long box version to complete your sets, got to get it up in the Maple Empire. And then a game I think I just have to throw at you for bragging rights. Panzer Dragoon Saga. Yes, I actually do own Panzer Dragoon Saga. I have all three of the Panzer Dragoon games. People will hate. First of all, this is a really good game. It is a fun RPG, and I'm not an RPG guy, but this is actually a fun game. But this game is crazy, famously expensive. Part of the reason was because it was a very tail end of the console life game. The Japanese version is obviously more common, but for it to be in English, it was barely released in Europe, barely released in the US. Rumor has it only like 10,000 copies of this game were ever shipped in the United States, or North America as a whole, because I'm including Canada in that. And yeah, so it was very uncommon and it has never been reissued. It lives and dies on this system. And supposedly the reason for that is because Sega lost the source code, as has more or less been confirmed over the course of time. So this game is just, it's kind of here forever. And that makes it crazy expensive. It's like the perfect combination of things to make something valuable. But this is where people will hate me on this. So years ago, I was already doing this channel. I've been doing this channel for 15 years. So maybe like 3 or 4 years into doing the channel, I went kind of like hardcore into the Saturn because my ultimate score with the Saturn, and there is a video on this back from, I want to say 2013. Some guy had emailed me, and he was like, hey man, I was just in this store in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he shows me a photo. He's like, it's got tons of Sega Saturn games, and they're all cheap. And even then, that was weird. So I only live 3 hours away. I live in Chicago. I drive out there. You can go see this video. It still exists on this channel. So I go to that store, and he was right. It was just a plethora, a wall of Sega Saturn. And it was one of these stores where every 5 games you buy, you get the 6th free. So I bought like 80-something Sega Saturn games because they were all reasonable. Like, we're talking about games being like $6 each. Like, it was crazy. This wasn't one of them. We'll get to that. But I bought all these games. I was super happy. And then I got in this mindset of like, I want a full Sega Saturn North American set. Never finished that, but I got into that mindset for a bit because I was like, dude, I just crushed 80 of them. There's like 230 or something on the system, so that's like a huge percentage. So I thought I could do this. And then I got lucky after that a few times where I got so one day I'm on eBay because I'm like, you don't see Sega Saturn games in the wild, even back then. It's very rare. That was a unique situation. And I was like, okay, I want the Panzer Dragoon games. That's obvious. It's such a definitive thing. Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2 especially, and Saga, obviously very iconically associated with the Saturn. But Saga in particular, crazy expensive. I'm probably never going to get them. One day I'm just clicking around on eBay. And I included this in a video, probably back in 2013, maybe it was 2014. I found a guy on eBay who had listed all 3 of them, complete, boxed, brand new, fresh. I mean, they were opened, obviously, but they were in great shape. $80. Free shipping. Buy it now. Not even an auction. Just So I looked at it real quick to see if there was like in the description if it said, oh, by the way, this is just a photo of the games. It's not real. You're an idiot. There's no way you're getting this for $80. Like I was looking for any clue to see if this was a problem. And so I was like, there's nothing like that. So I just bought it. I just didn't even fully think it through. I was like, just do it. And then I believe I unboxed it again back in like 2013, 2014. I showed the eBay link like in a screenshot and all that stuff. And it's like, yes, I really got Panzer Dragoon Saga for $80. And it came with 1 and 2 complete. This is the ultimate, I know you guys hate me type of thing. I'm sorry, but like, wow. So that was awesome to get. But yeah, funny enough, I never completed that set. One set I did complete though, is so the Saturn obviously came out in North America, and that's what I'm assuming most of this audience will remember. It obviously came out in Europe as well. In Europe, they had something like 32 exclusives, so not like a huge list. And I decided to track all those down. I ended up completing that goal actually only a couple of years ago. And I have videos on that quest and everything. I'm just going to show you a couple of highlights. One is a game called Deep Fear. Technically, this game did come out in Japan, but as far as it being translated into English and everything, it was only released in Europe. There is a North American build of this that has been dumped online, where it runs in the full 60 hertz and everything, and NTSC, so not PAL, etc. It's a really cool game. It basically, Sega decided to make their own Resident Evil clone in-house. Released in Japan, released in Europe, and was intended to be released here, but last minute was canceled despite being finished. Probably because of the marketing costs, and the game probably hadn't performed well in other regions. But this is, if you are a Resident Evil guy, or a girl, or a survival horror fan, etc., and you have a Saturn, look into this game. It's actually pretty cool. And the other one, this was the last one I ever got, and a huge shout out to a guy named Wubio, if he still watches the channel, Mega Man X3. We got X4 and Mega Man 8 in North America, but X3 was only released in Japan and Europe for whatever reason. And I wanted the European version, again, for language compatibility, you know, being the correct name, so it's not Rockman, etc., etc. So, yeah, he was cool enough to send this to me a few years ago. And yes, dude, I still have it. It's perfectly safe. But yeah, that's just a couple of examples of highlights from the European exclusive library. But obviously, we can't talk about the Saturn without talking about the Japanese stuff, because that's where the majority of games were. Like, North America had like 230, Europe had like 230. Like, that's not where the majority of it was. Japan had something like 1,200 exclusive titles or something like that. Like, it was astronomical because it was such a massive hit there. So I'm going to show you just a couple of examples for one reason or another. First up is a game called, well, I don't know if the full name, it's Segata Sanshiro Shinken Yugi. Yeah, I remember that now. This requires explanation. Segata Sanshiro was the mascot character for the Sega Saturn in Japan. It was basically this guy who was like a ninja, or more like a karate expert, more accurately, who, if you watch the commercials of him, it is some of the funniest stuff you'll ever see. Because the premise is, he basically would find people and beat them up and encourage them to play the Sega Saturn. So, like, there was a baseball game, right? And so he sees these kids, they're playing like real baseball, and they're having a good time. And he comes in, he beats the crap out of all these kids and tells them, don't do that, play baseball on the Sega Saturn. Like, that was the marketing campaign. There's one where he's like fighting a whole bunch of zombies and everything. And the very end of it, they gave him his own game, which is a series of mini games, some of which are fun, some are not so much, whatever. But they gave him his own game. And the commercial for this is really very interesting, because basically what's happening is Sega of Japan is sitting there in one of their meetings, and they're like, all right, we're going to be launching the Sega Dreamcast. They acknowledge it. There's a big Dreamcast swirl. This is our future project. And they cut away to like this crazy guy who has like a bomb, who's like a rocket. You know, it's like a almost like a V-2 rocket from World War II or whatever, a cruise missile if you want to think about a more modern reference. And he's just like a crazy guy who very clearly represents Sony and the PlayStation. That's clearly what he is. And this nutcase just like fires a bomb and he launches it right at, you know, Sega headquarters. He's like, I will destroy Sega because I am Sony. Like, that's the mission statement of the commercial. It's not even that subtle. Like, they don't call him Sony, but it's obvious that's what they're going for. And so like the missile's headed there, and just as about to blow up Sega headquarters and kill all these guys, Segata Sanshiro jumps on the missile because he's like superhuman, and he like guides it into space and blows up in orbit, and like his ghost just looks over Sega, and there was like a passing of the torch moment so that he died so that Sega and the Dreamcast could live on and all that sort of thing. That was the commercial for this game. Like, they were nuts over there. I highly recommend looking into Segata Sanshiro stuff. It's awesome. It's so bizarre. But yeah, it got its own game. A few other games worth mentioning here. Radiant Silvergun. Very cool shoot 'em up, released only on the Saturn in Japan. It has been reissued now multiple times digitally, like 360 got a version of this in North America. I believe the Switch even has a physical edition of it too. But originally this game came out there, and it's actually the precursor to Ikaruga, which was a great game for the Dreamcast, which also has been reissued many, many times, but that is a lot of fun. The original Dead or Alive. So the Dead or Alive franchise is obviously very big. A lot of people don't tend to know that the Sega Saturn actually had Dead or Alive 1 on it, but only in Japan again. This one doesn't require any sort of grasp of the Japanese language. Like, it probably would help a little, but it's just still like a fun fighting game. This is actually one of... I actually spent a lot of time on this one because I really enjoy the Dead or Alive games. I know, you wouldn't think I'm more of a... I love fighting games. I'm not good at them, but Dead or Alive, I've always just been like, I don't even care that I'm not good at this. I'm going to keep playing this. So that one's a lot of fun. And speaking of oddball fighting games, this is one that I think... I always demo this game with the Sega Pluto at conventions because this is a game that gets everybody's attention. It's very, very playable. And people are like, how have I never heard of that? This is a game called Rabbit. This is a 2D fighting game that basically just does what the Sega Saturn was intended for, which is beautiful 2D sprites, really cool 3D backgrounds, really smooth animations. It's really, really fun. And here's the weirdest part. It was made by EA. In Japan only for the Sega Saturn. I think it lives and dies. I don't think it's ever been reissued on anything else, which is bonkers. But it's a very, very fun game. In fact, this game has been fan-translated completely into English, even though you didn't really need it to begin with. It just makes it a little bit of a smoother experience. But yeah, that's out there now. So speaking of fan translations, one thing that's really cool about the Saturn now is now that there are things like ODEs, which can replace the disk drive, and we have devices like the Satiator, which is actually what I use in the Sega Pluto, by the way, so that when we take it to conventions, we're not using the disk drive. It's just this little card that goes in the back, uses an SD card, allows you to play games off of that. Because of that type of access now, we have a lot more interest in fan translations. As I said, that Japanese library of games is massive. So if you can translate that with more modern tech, and there's a lot of ways to do that now, there's a whole big library of brand new Sega Saturn games that we never got to enjoy. And so I just want to give you, a couple, like an example other than Rabbit, is Grandia. Now Grandia is a franchise I'm sure a lot of you RPG fans are very familiar with. The game came out in Japan on the Saturn. And it has been recently, relatively recently, translated completely into English. And this is an example of my buddy Dave, one of many Saturn Daves. There's so many. But he basically said, like, you know what? I can do, like, really cool fan art. This thing includes, like, a poster of the map of the game or whatever. Nice manual, back inlays. Now, ultimately, it is a CDR because it has to be. There's no way to press these discs anymore. But if you have a modded Saturn in any capacity, you could run it, but also just looks really good on a shelf. It's a very nice collector's piece and all that sort of thing. But this is just one example. There's tons of them. There's also an indie scene that's working on all sorts of brand new games for the system, etc. And the Saturn is kind of hot right now with that community because it's basically a system that a lot of us never really had a chance to dive into. And the cost of entry, or the barrier of entry, was always so high that it's finally, that's coming down a bit because you can get a cheap Japanese Saturn if you want. You can pop like a one-time expense of something like the Satiator, or even the cheaper solutions like a pseudo Saturn, whatever it is. And you can like trial these games you never had the opportunity to check out before and realize like, wow, this is crazy. There's so many unique games that live and die on the Sega Saturn. Like, I know Knights has been reissued a lot, Sonic Jam, technically a collection of stuff, but like Burning Rangers, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Deep Fear, Rabbit, etc. Like, these all live and die completely on this system. And that isn't even the end of where like the nostalgia stuff goes. 30th anniversaries aside, we've actually seen some more modern references to it, even from Sega themselves. So like we had the Panzer Dragoon remake. This is the Nintendo Switch version that Limited Run Games did. But as you can see, it comes in a Sega Saturn case. They actually mass-produced new cases. They even did a variant that shows it saying Sega Saturn all over it, even though it obviously isn't an actual Sega Saturn game. And so, like, yeah, it's just kind of an interesting era where I'm really happy that people are going back to the Saturn and kind of shaping the narrative as, like, here's what we missed, as opposed to here's what failed, which is a good direction to take everything on that. So very, very, cool to see the scene really kind of embrace it more. And I myself was guilty of it in the past. Like, when I finally had heard of what the Saturn was, the story that had always been presented, like, back then, the news you were getting was like, I got the system and I would go into a GameStop and be like, do you have Sega Saturn stuff? And they're like, no, the thing's stupid. It failed. Like, you're talking to like these slightly older high school or college students who kind of remembered the system, and they just had that like clickbait narrative, if you want to call it that, of what the story of the Saturn was. No deep intellectual discussion of what it actually was. And that's what I hope we did a little bit, today. So, with that said, I hope you guys go out and play your Sega Saturn today, if you have one. If not, think about getting one. Again, barrier to entry is much cheaper than it used to be if you're willing to do like ODEs. If you're actually going to try and buy some of the games, that's where it gets very difficult. But, it is what it is. So, yeah, go out, play your Sega Saturn if you have one. And if not, again, consider getting one. But in the meantime, if you guys could do me a favor, leave some comments. Talk to me about this. Did you have a Saturn growing up? What was your story with it? Anything, just tell me whatever. Or just be like, I loved your video. I hated your video. Your hair is too short. Your hair is too long. I don't really care. Just let's chit chat. But anyway, please do that. Like the video as well. And subscribe if you've never done that before. And on top of that, if you could do me a favor, in the description, you have all sorts of social media stuff for me. I've got my Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, really appreciate that, Spreadshirt, and my travel channel. I appreciate the support on all those sort of platforms. And if you liked this idea of like a 30th anniversary video, I must remind you, I just did one of these for the Sega 32X yesterday. And I did one for the Nintendo DS the day before that. So I say, go out and watch those, have a good time, get nostalgic, and have fun. Play your video games. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all later.